The Hamas terrorist group has released 2 more hostages. The announcement came after Israeli forces conducted overnight ground operations in the Gaza Strip. NTD's Jason Perry has the latest.
On Monday, the Hamas terrorist group released 2 more hostages, both Israeli citizens, 80-year-old Nurit Cooper and 85-year-old Yocheved Lifshitz. A Hamas spokesman said they released the 2 women for humanitarian and health reasons. However, both of their husbands remain in captivity. Meanwhile, the Israeli military remains focused on freeing the rest of the hostages. On Sunday, Israeli forces conducted limited ground operations in Gaza and not only killed Hamas terrorists, but also gathered intelligence. 1 Israeli soldier was killed in the operation.
We located over 1,000 bodies and captives, terrorists we are holding on to. I repeat, we got over 1,000 bodies and captives. All of them are Hamas members that are interrogated, identified, classified together with our intelligence efforts regarding the missing and hostages.
Through this intelligence gathering process, Israel updated the total number of hostages taken by Hamas to 222, now 220 after the latest hostages were released. Israeli President Isaac Herzog, in an exclusive interview on Sky News, also shared some alarming intelligence discovered on the body of a Hamas terrorist.
This is material which was found on the body of one of those sadistic villains. It's Al-Qaeda material. Official Al-Qaeda material. And in this material, there were instructions how to produce chemical weapons.
If confirmed, this would be a clear violation of the Geneva Convention and international law, which strictly forbid the use of chemical weapons. As of Monday, over 1,400 Israelis have been killed, mostly civilians who were killed by Hamas terrorists while attending a music festival. And according to the Hamas-run health ministry, more than 4,600 Gazans have been killed. Meanwhile, Gaza's other border is also active, with trucks carrying humanitarian aid. As of Monday, at least 3 humanitarian aid convoys entered Gaza through the Rafah crossing from Egypt to deliver aid to the Palestinian people. Also, in regards to the humanitarian situation, Israel's president said that Israel is only responsible for 7% of the water in Gaza. And he said there is fuel for humanitarian needs under the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. Jason Perry, NTD News.
President Biden speaking out about hostage negotiations with Hamas. That's as the U.S. is deploying more forces to prevent the war from widening. Joining us now live is NTD's White House correspondent, Iris Tao. Good evening, Iris. What did the president say today about the hostage situation?
Good evening to you, Tiff. So at an event this afternoon, a reporter asked President Biden if he would support a ceasefire in exchange for the release of hostages. And here is what President Biden said. Watch.
Why did you? We should have a ceasefire. It's not a ceasefire. We should have those hostages released, and then we can talk.
So we did hear President Biden having to correct himself a little bit here, but the idea is that President Biden called on Hamas to release the hostages before entertaining the prospect of any talks regarding a ceasefire. We also heard the White House today calling on the public to not trust Hamas' words when it comes to reports that they would release hostages in exchange for a ceasefire. Here's what White House National Security spokesperson John Kirby told us this afternoon. Watch.
We got to take anything that Hamas says with a huge grain of salt. We don't take anything that they say at face value. Here's an idea, and it's just an idea I'll throw out there. They could release them all now. Just let them go now, because these people didn't do anything wrong. They're just innocent civilians being caught up in this conflict. Let them go now. Now, I recognize that's not going to happen, which is why we're going to keep working with our partners in the region to do what we can to get them released.
And Kirby said that he wouldn't go into any details regarding any negotiations when it comes to the hostage situation because he says that would risk the opportunities of getting more of them out. But Kirby did say today that the White House continues to believe that among the 10 Americans who are still missing, they believe that there are about a handful of them who are being taken hostage by Hamas. Tiff.
And Iris, in addition to the hostage situation, what is the administration doing to strengthen our posture in the Middle East, especially after a spate of recent drone and rocket attacks on American troops there?
So regarding these recent attacks, the White House today specifically called out Iran, saying it has been supporting the groups behind these attacks, and in some cases it has proactively facilitated these attacks. Meanwhile, in response, the White House says President Biden has directed the Department of Defense to strengthen U.S. posture in that region, including by redirecting a U.S. carrier strike group, the Eisenhower strike group, directly to the Middle East instead of the Eastern Mediterranean. And in addition, is also sending more air defense capabilities to U.S. air bases in the region. And of course, the goal of all these moves is to deter any countries in that region from trying to get involved and widen this war. Tiff.
Iris, thank you for that update. The New York Times is now admitting error in its coverage of the explosion at a hospital in Gaza. The New York Times initially reported that Israel was behind the hospital explosion. The paper is now correcting that claim. The Times said it relied too heavily on reports from the Hamas terrorist group, but didn't make that clear enough. It says giving the claim prominence in a headline, news alert, and on social media gave a false impression. The Times wasn't the only outlet making this mistake. Various papers blamed Israel for the explosion in news alerts, and many backtracked their reports later. More backlash against Harvard over student support for Palestine. A former governor is now withdrawing from fellowships at the university. Former Maryland Governor Larry Hogan is not interested in Harvard fellowships anymore. Hogan condemned what he calls Harvard's failure to immediately and forcefully denounce anti-Semitic vitriol. That's over a letter signed by over 30 student groups. The students blamed Israel for the terrorist attacks, which killed more than 1,000 civilians. Hogan says he can't support dangerous anti-Semitism allegedly taking place at Harvard. Former President Trump claims Sidney Powell was, quote, never his attorney. This comes 3 days after Powell pleaded guilty in the Georgia RICO case. NTD's legal correspondent Arlene Richards has more.
Former President Trump broke his silence on Sunday with a tacit response to attorney Sidney Powell's guilty plea last week. He said in a social media post that Ms. Powell was not my attorney and never was.
Guilty.
Powell pleaded guilty on October 19 to 6 misdemeanor charges in the Georgia RICO case brought by District Attorney Fani Willis against 19 defendants, including Trump. She admitted to 6 counts of conspiring to intentionally interfere with the performance of election duties. Trump said in his post that Powell was one of millions and millions of people who thought, and in ever-increasing numbers still think, correctly, that the 2020 presidential election was rigged and stolen. But some question the former president's claim that Powell was never his attorney. On November 19, 2020, Powell, flanked by a team of Trump's attorneys, said this about the election.
President Trump won by a landslide. We are going to prove it, and we are going to reclaim the United States of America for the people who vote for freedom.
Just 4 days before that, on November 14, 2020, Trump said in a then Twitter post that attorney Rudy Giuliani was spearheading a team to fight for free and fair elections. He then named the members of Giuliani's team, which included Sidney Powell. But a week later, Trump's 2020 campaign legal team announced that Powell was not a member of the team. In a statement on November 22, 2020, the team's leader Giuliani and team member Jenna Ellis said Powell was practicing law on her own, and that she is also not a lawyer for the president in his personal capacity. Powell reportedly had made bold statements about the voting process without evidence, including strong claims of ballot tampering. Trump's 2020 campaign told the Washington Post at the time that she was too crazy even for the president. As her Georgia trial approached, Powell distanced herself from Trump. Her attorneys said in court filings that she did not represent President Trump or the Trump campaign because she never signed an engagement agreement to be their attorney.
Senator Bob Menendez maintaining his innocence. He had a second arraignment today in connection to his conspiracy and bribery charges. The senator returned to a Manhattan court to face a superseding indictment, which accuses him of acting as a foreign agent for Egypt. He pleaded not guilty. Federal prosecutors on October 12th accused the New Jersey Democrat of acting on behalf of Egyptian military and intelligence officials from 2018 to 2022. At the time, Menendez said piling new charge upon new charge does not make the allegations true. He has refused to step down since the first indictment against him was announced in September. The senator, his wife, and 3 businessmen are accused of corruption involving bribery, conspiracy, and receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash and gold bars. House Republicans have gone back to the drawing board today for the 3rd time, meeting to select a new Speaker nominee. This after Congressman Jim Jordan failed to get enough support to secure the gavel last week. NTD's Melina Weiskup has updates for us.
House Republicans are headed back behind closed doors in a 3rd attempt to choose a nominee that could have a chance at taking the Speaker's gavel. They'll be meeting tonight at 6:30 for that candidate forum where 9 candidates will be laying out their vision for the future of the House of Representatives. Tomorrow, they're going to hold an internal vote to select their nominee. And what we're going to be looking for tomorrow's vote is how that nominee emerges, because we know back when Steve Scalise won the nomination and Jim Jordan, they fell far short of the votes they would have needed to secure the gavel on the House floor. So we'll be looking to see how this result plays out tomorrow morning as an indicator as to whether or not Republicans have been able to work out some of those fissures that are still in the Republican Party. Now, as for the candidates themselves, the majority of these candidates are not even among the ranks of leadership. The candidate who has the highest ranking position in leadership is Tom Emmer. He's currently the Republican whip, and he's not necessarily a household name, but he did win the endorsement of former Speaker Kevin McCarthy. He did try to win over former President Trump's support in a phone call, although Trump withheld his endorsement for Emmer or any other candidate in this race. But the key thing to note about Emmer here is that he may have a difficult time securing votes from the most conservative members in the party, particularly because he supports legislation that they aren't necessarily willing to support, things such as Ukraine aid, same-sex marriage. He also supported the continuing resolution that actually got McCarthy ousted in the first place. So he may have some trouble with that conservative wing of the party. Others who are among the ranks of leadership but are lesser known are Mike Johnson, who's the vice chair of the Republican Conference, and Kevin Hern, who's the chairman of the Republican Study Committee. Now, of those members who are not among the ranks of leadership, these are members such as Jack Birdman or Pete Sessions, ones that you really don't hear their name very often. But a key candidate I want to mention here is Byron Donalds. He makes very frequent media appearances. He's very outspoken. He also has friends across the Republican spectrum, with moderates, with conservatives. He also was actually one of the 20 members who originally opposed McCarthy back in January and forced him to make concessions at that time. So we'll definitely be looking to see how both Donalds and Emmer are faring after tonight's candidate forum, as well as tomorrow morning when they do hold that internal vote for the nomination. Reporting from Capitol Hill, Melina Weiskup, NTD News.
Will the GOP be able to unify over a House Speaker? To dive deeper into the political shuffling and how lawmakers could rise above it, we have Republican Representative Mike Flood from Nebraska. Congressman Mike Flood, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, the House has been without a speaker for 3 weeks. 9 Republicans are now vying for the gavel. You launched a unity pledge for the next Republican speaker. To begin, tell us why you're launching this pledge.
Well, I was sitting there in the conference room last Friday, and Jim Jordan had just given his concession speech that he was withdrawing his nomination. And I thought, we don't have a majority party if we don't vote as a majority. And because of that, I thought before we do another round of voting, we need to decide, are we in the majority? Because if we are, we all have to agree to support the nominee. That doesn't mean the nominee has to get 217 votes in the conference. It means that once the nominee has been named, that person should be unanimously elected by every single Republican in the majority when we go to the floor. And I think it's important to hold people to that standard. I like the fact that 8 of the 9 candidates for Speaker have signed the pledge. What I want now is I want those same candidates to go to their supporters and say, allow me to show the rest of the conference that I can bring diverse groups of people together, because I'm looking for somebody that can unite us.
The allies of the conservative House Freedom Caucus are urging opposition. What's your message to them?
I think that if the question is, are we going to be unified? The answer should always be yes, we're in this together. We are in this together. The American people did not elect Democrats to be in the majority. They sent a majority of Republicans. And we saw what happened when all the Democrats had a chance to vote on this. They voted to create a vacancy in the chair. It's disappointing to hear that some of the membership doesn't think this is a good idea. What's more important to me is that when the time comes to support our nominee, that they vote for the nominee. And that's the process that I think is important and that we should be prioritizing.
And this comes at a time when there is a lot of pressure on the House. There's the Israel-Hamas war unfolding, Ukraine, and no speaker. And are you in favor of empowering the pro temp speaker to be able to push forward legislation if there is still no speaker going forward?
I supported Jim Jordan, and last week he, for a brief time, supported the idea of giving Patrick McHenry those powers, and so did I. I think it's entirely reasonable to identify someone to immediately start having the powers of the speaker so that we can consider other legislation. It would crush me if we received the aid package from the Senate and were unable to deal with it because we haven't named a speaker. We have to do the people's business. I was at home in Nebraska yesterday. I ran into a lady of mature age who I could tell had a lot of anxiety, and she was worrying about the fact that the House of Representatives didn't have a speaker. And she's been watching this on TV, and I thought, this isn't fair to her. She should expect more from her government. She shouldn't spend her Sunday afternoon worrying that her government doesn't have one of the two chambers in the bicameral, a leadership post named. That's not fair to her. And so we just need to get this done and move on.
And on that last part, what is your message to Americans who have been watching this whole process play out and might be becoming disenchanted with House Republicans in particular? What's your message to them?
They need to know there are hundreds of us in the Republican majority that are working very hard to get to a place where we can name a speaker and get the House of Representatives back open. There are people like me that are calling our colleagues saying we must be unified. And, I think when you watch the news, you end up seeing the handful of folks that have voted against our nominee on the floor. They have to remember that 8 Republicans joined with every single Democrat to remove Kevin McCarthy as Speaker. And we're not talking about a lot of people. But, I voted for Jim Jordan last week because I felt he could unite us. And there were a different subset of members that didn't feel that way. So at the end of the day, let's vote with the majority, get this back on track, and do the people's business.
And on the point of unity, what qualities does a candidate need to be able to unite the party?
Well, and that's one of the things that's important to me about the pledge. If you are a good legislative leader, and I was the Speaker of the Nebraska legislature for 6 years, a good speaker can go up to another member and listen to their concerns, find a way to remedy their concerns, and inspire them to join the rest of us in the greater pursuit of passing bills and moving the country forward. I'm looking for somebody that has that knack and ability to walk into a room full of folks that may have an issue on a certain bill, sit down, listen, come up with some constructive ways to move forward, and see if we can't find a win-win, when possible, so that we can pass bills. That's the litmus test in the Unity Pledge. Can you influence people to come with you and inspire them to be on a team? I think Jim Jordan had those qualities. It's unfortunate that he's not here doing this again, because I'd vote for him again. But that's where we find ourselves. And I'm withholding my vote for Speaker until I have the chance to see who is the best one of the 9 candidates to bring people together.
And zooming out, what would you say to those in other countries who are saying this is an example of why democracy doesn't work and point to their, say, authoritarian governments as a better option? What would you say to them?
Democracy is messy, but it is the best system on earth. And because we have 3 different branches of government, because we have a separate executive and judiciary and a legislative branch, we can weather this. We are strong. We are capable of defending ourselves. This is This is going to be a blip on the radar, an unfortunate one, but it will not be the issue it is today in a month, because we'll have bigger issues to deal with. America is strong, and suppressing people's speech, torturing people for their views, doing what those Hamas terrorists did in Israel, that's pure evil. That's folks that are tied to evil, where we represent freedom. And so our system is still better any day than any other system out there. And that's why we are and have been and remain the strongest sole superpower in the world. And we have a duty to lead. And that's what we're in the process of getting back on track here.
Congressman Mike Flood, thank you so much for your time.
You bet. Have a good day. Thank you.
Welcome back. Is the sun setting on environmental, social, and governance investing, or ESG? Data shows that ESG is seeing signs of significant decline in the U.S. For details, we spoke with NTD Business host Don Ma. Don Ma, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, always great to be here, Tiffany.
To begin, are we starting to see ESG disappear from the investing world?
Well, you know, Tiff, I think I can say with a degree of certainty that it's showing signs of decline. I mean, at the very least, the term ESG is not as it once was. Some are even saying that the market for environmental, social, and corporate governance investing is fundamentally broken. And here's some data points that's showing a potential decline for ESG. And I think the numbers here speak for themselves. So the total flow of investments into US ESG funds has been zero to slightly in the negative, actually, in the first quarter of 2022, according to CNN data. In the US, assets under management in ESG funds declined $24 billion from the second quarter to the end of September. So those are just some numbers for a reference.
And why are we seeing this decline in ESG when a few years ago it was so popular?
Well, you know, when something is flawed, right, it's only a matter of time before people start to realize it and it just falls apart. The problem with ESG, first of all, is that its scoring system doesn't really work. ESG scores for companies actually doesn't tell you anything meaningful about the overall company. It's very vague. And on top of that, companies can game the system in various ways to get a higher ESG score, even if the company is actually not that good for the environment. Sometimes you have, for example, a fracking company getting an A+ on the environment, and you have a company like Netflix getting a D- on the environment. Or you have an electric car company like Tesla getting a lower ESG score than an oil company. You know, it just doesn't make sense.
And how does ESG investing perform in terms of return?
Yeah, that's the biggest question here. To put it simply, ESG funds perform poorly financially because in a Journal of Finance paper, University of Chicago researchers found that the highest rated funds in terms of sustainability did not outperform the lowest rated sustainability funds. And, you know, besides that, let me just add another point. So another problem with ESG investing is that it actually makes no difference to the environment. Some companies simply rebrand by adding words such as sustainable or ESG or green or climate to their names, but actually do nothing for the environment. So, you know, if you want to actually be environmentally responsible, you want to be a responsible investor, there's actually only one way to achieve that goal. And according to investing services and solutions company RIA, you must invest directly in private startup companies that focus on climate-related issues.
Quite fascinating. Well, Don Ma, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Tiffany.
A 7-Eleven was overrun by looters in Sacramento County, California. No injuries were reported, and the police are working to identify the people involved. NTD's Jason Blair brings us that story.
The Sacramento County Sheriff's Office released this video on Friday. It shows dozens of people looting and vandalizing a 7-Eleven in Rio Linda. The incident happened on October 8th after a nearby sideshow. The police believe some of the suspects are from the San Francisco Bay Area. They're asking for tips and offering up to $1,000 for info leading to any arrests. The public can call 1-800-AA-CRIME. Not too far away in San Francisco, both a CVS and Walgreens will close stores located downtown within the coming month. Specific reasons have not been cited yet for these closures. However, Walgreens has noted retail theft and cost cutting before with previous closings. Rite Aid also announced that it's closing 154 stores nationwide, including 34 in California. The company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy last week. All of this comes after recent data was released by the FBI. It shows that violent crime in California rose by 8.5% from 2020 to 2022, while in the nation as a whole it dropped by 3.5%. Reporting in California, Jason Blair, NTD News.
Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell says China, Iran, and Russia pose the most significant threats to the U.S. On Fox News Sunday, the Kentucky Republican used a phrase coined by President George W. Bush following the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001.
This is an emergency. It's an emergency that we step up and deal with this axis of evil, China, Russia, Iran.
So how does this new axis of evil threaten the democracies of the world, and how should the U.S. respond? We speak with the publisher of the journal Political Risk, who sees a leading role for the U.S. as the international guarantor of peace and freedom. Anders Court, thank you so much for joining us. Great to be back on the show.
Thank you.
To begin, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell says the Israel-Hamas war is a, quote, worldwide problem, and he goes on to call China, Russia, and Iran the axis of evil, saying it's an immediate threat to the U.S. Should we be looking at these countries as connected instead of separate?
Absolutely. China has been supporting Russia in its war against Ukraine. China and Russia have both supported Iran. Iran supports Hamas in its attacks on Israel. Unfortunately, they're all collaborating together for their own arguably evil purposes of attacking innocent civilians and democracies. All we're waiting for now is China to jump into Taiwan and start bombing that country. I mean, unfortunately, that's the reality is that countries, illiberal dictatorships like this, like to attack at the same time so that it makes it more difficult for the democracies and reasonable alliances to defend themselves.
And on that note, what kind of threat do they pose to the U.S. when united together?
They are, the United States has really been for decades the guarantor of international peace and freedom, democracy, human rights around the world. And of course, that costs a lot of money, and unfortunately, taxpayers are having to pay that. But in the long run, we do need to find new sources of revenue to provide global security as we have been. But it's also for our benefit that we don't allow these dictators to get bigger and more powerful. If they take Taiwan, if they take Israel, if they take Ukraine, they become more powerful. And in the future, 10, 20 years down the road, they can use that additional territory and power against us.
And now McConnell went on to note it's an emergency for the U.S. to step up and deal with this axis of evil. Is our current policy towards these countries strong enough?
It's a good question. I think that we need to definitely increase our economic sanctions on countries like Russia and China and Iran. We should stop negotiating for hostages. I mean, we just basically gave Iran billions of dollars for just a couple of hostages. We've relieved Venezuela of the oil embargo there. Again, for just a few hostages. We can't keep funding these countries, including through the IMF, World Bank, most favored nation status for China in terms of trade with the United States. We just can't keep doing that and expect them to respect our values when they're trampling all over them and we just keep handing them money. It just doesn't make sense.
Then how does the U.S. step up, as McConnell says?
I think that what McConnell's looking for, of course, is increased funding for the Ukraine war and for Israel, and they're trying to combine those two into a single bill to force everyone to vote yes on them. Whereas some of the Republicans, led by people like Matt Gaetz in the House, do not want to pay for Ukraine, but do want to pay for Israel. So I think that's the basis of the conflict right now in Washington. Yes, we should be supporting all of these democracies, but at the same time, we need to be careful about our debt. The interest payments alone are getting unsustainable, unfortunately.
And Anders, you mentioned China. So zooming out a bit, the Philippines is summoning the Chinese ambassador. That's after a near collision over the weekend in the South China Sea between a Chinese Coast Guard and two Philippine military vessels. What is the message here? How should we read this near miss?
China is trying to bully the Philippines, Vietnam, other South China Sea countries into basically giving up the South China Sea, which is a large body of water the size of India, with probably trillions of dollars of oil and gas underneath it. A third of the world's shipping goes through there. It's very important for Taiwan and Japan and the Philippines, obviously all of those South China Sea nations, and all countries that get trade. So, we can't let China do that. The South China Sea has for forever essentially been used by communities throughout that area, and those also include Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, and we just can't hand that over to China because they claim it to be theirs. The International Court has already made a statement that invalidated China's South China Sea claims. So the United States does need to get tougher on China. We've, since the 70s and 80s and 90s, China has been grabbing little islands, fighting a war against Vietnam to grab some islands, killing, soldiers there from other countries, sinking ships, so the U.S. needs to step in and really protect those countries. And, we and our allies need to do more. Absolutely.
And expanding on that last point, how should the Philippines and the U.S. be responding to this?
Well, I mean, we should be really what the Philippines would like to do is drill for oil and gas in its exclusive economic zone. So they should go ahead and do that. And the U.S. government and allies, including Japan, Australia, India, should use their navies to protect that oil and gas drilling. And, that is the crux of the matter.
Anders Korn, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
While in Hong Kong, California's governor tells the public in a climate change talk that they'll always have a partner in California. Governor Gavin Newsom also visited Israel and is working to send humanitarian aid to Israel and Gaza. NTD's David Lamb reports.
California Governor Gavin Newsom visited Israel recently before heading to China. Newsom assured during his week-long trip to China that his state will always be a partner on climate issues, no matter how the U.S. presidential election turns out.
After I'm gone, I promise you, Democrat or Republican, you're going to have someone that's there for the long haul on these issues, that believes foundationally these issues. I want you to know, regardless of what happens nationally, subnationally, you have a partner in the state of California.
Newsom's visit to University of Hong Kong on Monday comes as U.S.-China relations witnessed a sharp decline in recent years due to trade disputes, U.S. support for self-governing Taiwan, and other human rights concerns, among other issues. Before his China trip, he visited the Tel Aviv Sourasky Medical Center in Israel on Friday, meeting with survivors, families, and others, including those from California impacted by the Israel-Hamas war. Newsom said, "Despite the horror, what I saw and heard from the people of Israel was a profound sense of resilience, a commitment to community and common purpose, especially in these most difficult of times. According to Newsom's office, California is working to ship medical supplies to support humanitarian relief efforts in Israel and Gaza. David Lamb, NTD News, California.
How did Israel become a state? Both Jews and Arabs have connections to the land. NTD's Jack Bradley speaks with Israel's former chief archivist to explore the historical background of the Jewish state.
In the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire ruled the land where Israel is now located. At that time, the area was inhabited mostly by Arabs. The Ottoman Empire was on the losing side in World War I and ceased to exist after the war. Great Britain took over the lands that are now Israel and the Palestinian territories. In the Balfour Declaration of 1917, Britain expressed support for establishing a home for the Jewish people on that land. After World War II, more and more Jews migrated to the area. In 1947, the United Nations created a plan to partition the land into Jewish and Arab states. The Jews liked the plan, the Arabs did not. When the State of Israel was officially established in 1948, the surrounding Arab countries opposed it vehemently.
The Jews and the Palestinians both equally have perfectly legitimate claims to the land. Ultimately, the only solution for the both of them is that both of them end up with states of their own alongside each other.
Yaakov Lozowick is Israel's former chief archivist. He says the Jewish right to the land is rooted in history. The Jewish presence there dates back over 3,000 years. The Jewish people wrote their scriptures there. Jesus, who was a Jew, lived there. Jerusalem is the center of the Jewish world, and both the Bible and even the Quran refer to the Jewish people's ties to the land.
There have been Jews in this land always, perhaps with the exception of a few years after the Crusaders conquered in 1099 and murdered all the Jews and then didn't let them back in. But other than that, there have been Jews here always.
The surrounding Arab countries aren't convinced by this history. Many in those countries argue that in more recent history, the land was populated mostly by Arabs and that it's entirely their land. The conflicts continue to this day. Jack Bradley, NTD News.
Welcome back, and now for your sports news, we welcome NTD's Dave Martin. Dave, we have a Game 7 tonight in what has been an unpredictable ALCS. Now, are you still sticking with Houston despite Max Scherzer starting for the Rangers?
Yes, I'm going with my original pick, even though it doesn't make much sense to go against Max Scherzer. They did get to him in Game 4, after all. But this series, like you said, has been unpredictable. I mean, the road team has lost all 6 games. It's been full of twists. I mean, we thought Houston was done after losing the first 2 at home. Then we thought Texas was done after losing the next 3 in a row. So I'm expecting nothing less than a back-and-forth Game 7 with Houston coming out on top.
And now Game 5 might have had the most excitement as Vandalise Garcia was hit by a pitch, resulting in a near brawl and several ejections. How do umpires determine whether it's intentional or not?
Yeah, it's a judgment call. This is a question that's never really been answered by Major League Baseball, officially anyway. Unofficially, if you hit a big home run, take your time around the bases while celebrating the entire way, then get drilled with a fastball next time up, it's usually considered intentional, which is what happened. Now, Garcia did get the last laugh, though, with a big home run yesterday. Meanwhile, the Astros pitcher, he's suspended for 2 games, including tonight's game. Normally for Game 7, sometimes you end up emptying your bullpen, so we'll have to see if that comes into play tonight.
Now, moving over to the NLCS, Arizona has made this a series, winning games 3 and 4, though their backs are against the wall today. Do you think the Phillies close it out today at home?
Yes. Although, like you said, the Arizona has impressed me winning a couple of games, even though they're by 1 run each. You know, a win is a win. But the Phillies have outscored them by 15 runs this series. Ketel Marte of Arizona has been incredible. He's just one of those players who hits well under pressure. Meanwhile, the Phillies, someone described them as an old school softball team. Big guys with big beards who hit big home runs. But they do it very well at this stage. Now, granted, they're losing 4-1 right now, but I think they go ahead and win it tonight.
And now, switching gears to the NFL, one of your favorites in the AFC, the Buffalo Bills, dropped to 4-3 yesterday after a loss to New England. What do you make of them now?
Yeah, I'm perplexed by them. It's also a sign of the times that losing to Bill Belichick and the Patriots means your team might be struggling. You know, their losses have been close, and most of their wins have been blowouts. I mean, they beat the Dolphins by 4 touchdowns just a few weeks ago. They have had some injuries. Matt Milano is out, but I think they'll get it together soon. They're going to have to, because they've got a trio of games coming up against the Chiefs, Cowboys, and Eagles, so we'll know a whole lot more then. So you'll have to ask me in another month or so.
Well, as always, thanks for joining us, Dave.
Thank you, Tiff.
If you have any news, tips, or feedback for the show, you can email us at eveningnews@ntd.com. That's all for today's news. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Good night.